At this moment, I'd invite Sam, Kevin, Michael, I think you're in the session again, and JJ for the 3 PPI enablement session. Sam?
Thank you, Simeon. Let me share my screen. Simeon, can you confirm when you see the...
Yes, I can.
Right. Thank you, Simeon. Hi, everyone. This is Sam again. I'm a Mojo Loop community contributor and a community representative at the Community Council as well. So here we have JJ, Michael, and Kevin representing the third-party team. We'll start off with a brief, a very quick update on where the status of Mojo Loop third-party features is. We'll look at the work done in this PI. And then we'll open the floor. JJ and Michael will talk about the enhancements and changes to the API and more things to come. So we'll start off with the third-party feature status, an overview of PI 18, and then I'll pass it on to JJ and Michael. Thanks to all the contributors. Kevin has been heavily doing the implementation. Others have been working on reviews, API changes, and various things. A quick overview of where we are. Initially, we had the POC, MVP. We did some work to productionize in this year, in the previous phase and for earlier part of this phase, which is now done. And then we are looking forward to more enhancements and then adoption soon. So where are we with the third-party features? As most of you probably know by then, we have a standard version of the third-party API version 1.0. Enhancements and various extensions to that are now in review. Michael and JJ will cover that. So the third-party services, we have an implementation that works. We have end-to-end tests that are run on a regular basis. Whenever Mojo Loop releases are made, whenever a release candidate is done and incrementally services are updated, we run 3 collections. As we've discussed before, we have the third-party collection, bulk collection, and of course the FSP interoperability golden path collection. So that is done. We believe that these are now production quality, ready to be adopted. Obviously, adoption is an entirely different beast, but we believe that it's ready for that. And then this may fly under the radar, but the documentation and sequence diagrams have been updated to reflect implementation. They were out of sync, so that is now taken care of as well. An initial design for the GSP API adapter was done, which would have allowed GPay to interact with Mojo Loop services. But yeah, this is, I think, one of the updates from this PI that we had to put a pause on the GSP API adapter implementation because Google Standard Payments API is going through some changes that JJ is working on, which actually I think improves how it aligns with Mojo Loop. But for now, we had to pause it there so that we can pick it up once there is clarity on that. So in this PI, the functional tests were upgraded to the version 1.0. There is a demo video for that I've included in this deck. We have Helm charts for third-party functionality now included in V14. We've seen earlier today in the first session, the third-party collection tests were updated, and there were breaking changes because there were resource changes and data model changes that happened. Because some of the services were previously using a non-standard 0.1 version of the API, and now they've been upgraded to version 1.0. And as part of some reconciliation effort that was done, we now have the JWS functionality applied to the third-party requests. Previously, that wasn't there. So essentially, it includes MTLS, mutual TLS, and JWS now supported for third-party requests as well. Of course, some maintenance changes there. We have the third-party services node version upgraded to version 16, along with the rest of the Mojo Loop core services. That is also now available as a Mojo Loop dev release or release candidate. And then the TTK tests have been updated for the latest version as well. Another significant update, which the developers and we see on a daily basis, is functional testing is now made part of the CI/CD pipeline. Whereas previously we have to do release testing and other end-to-end testing. Now this is part of the daily pull requests and merges. Of course, we also have the Slack notifications. It might be a little bit of overwhelming for people who are not developing or actively contributing, but we have an announcements channel that is public open. Feel free to join and follow, where we see several updates of releases, GitHub releases, NPM packages, Docker images, and also test results that are run on particular releases as well. I don't know if JJ has plans to cover that, but the third-party API implementation has been put on hold. We will revive and pick it up once the draft version for the new GSP API is out, and I will continue that effort. To summarize, Mojaloop 3 PPI support is done. We believe that it is supported, but we are looking for two real things. One, third-party backend, third-party implementation like GPay, which we have GSP API, and an FSP who wants to adopt and try out third-party features as well. That will give us clarity on how to develop specific adapters for those. But otherwise, the core and the third-party functionality supports this. We have payment manager support for third-party features. On the FSP connections, we believe that for demo and testing purposes, this can be done using our existing components like TTK and third-party adapter SDK components. But if you want like a real demo, then we need something like an FSP who wants to do, and we need their core solution to be able to adapt. So a couple of demos, I've included links here. There is an end-to-end test video for third-party tests, which is part of this deck. We'll provide that. And there is a demo as well at the end. I've included a few slides in the appendix section as well, which might give an overview of how we envision this to look like as a component diagram for Mojaloop. We've covered this in detail in our previous community events, so I'd like to skip those. But yeah. Here is a link to the demo and some general information. That is where we are with the TTK. I'd like to pass it on to Michael and JJ for more interesting and open discussions on upcoming third-party features that are in design and review.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think that question of whether it's more interesting, we will leave to the audience. But we do want this to be an interactive session. This is really to get opinions, to get people talking and discussing about where we should take the PISP interface next. So are you seeing my screen? I'll take that as a yes. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Okay. So where are we now? We have an implementation of the PISP interface, which supports initiation of payments from an existing account and reliable and secure authorization of those payments from a customer's device. We've also got an automated means of establishing a relationship between an account holding institution, a DFSP, and a third-party payment initiator in respect of one or more customer accounts. And for the moment, that is restricted to the ability to initiate transfers from those accounts, but we have plans to extend that in the future. We've also refactored the interface to align it better with the way in which PISPs actually work. When we went through the the process of looking at the integration of our PISP interface with the Mali interface, it was clear that we had rather got things the wrong way around as far as how a PISP wanted to use the interface. So we refactored it to better align with what we wanted to have. So now the question is, where do we go from here? We have some candidates. First of all, bulk requests. Now, if we imagine, for instance, a payroll fintech, which wants to run payrolls for multiple customers who bank with different DFSPs, we would expect that this would really just extend the existing bulk interface to a request to pay to include that. We also might want to think about requesting payment without authorization. And an example here is to think, let's say, of a fintech which provides services to customers, and the fintech wants to reduce its operating costs by sending reminders to its customers that subscription payments are due. Another example might be, for instance, an app that supports merchants who run credit accounts, and they may want to send out requests at the end of each month to say to all the credit account customers, this is what you owe, please pay up. But in both cases, the customers, we would expect, would authorize the payments via their DFSP in the normal way. They wouldn't rely on the PISP for the authorization. And this is essentially an extension of merchant request to pay as we currently have it. Finally, there's the question of bill payment. Now, when a customer pays their electricity bill, the utility wants to know that that's happened so that they can adjust the customer's account balance. The same might be true, for instance, for a company like M-Kopa. If someone pays their M-Kopa subscription, then M-Kopa needs to know about it in order to understand how to update their account to make sure that the payment is actually recorded and they don't get their solar power cut off. This could be done, we think, via a version of account initiation service provision, which basically says, notify me whenever there's a movement on this account. So at the moment, we normally think of AISP as being a pull service, where someone says, tell me what my balance is, tell me what my last 5 transactions are. Whereas this, we think, would be a push service. So whenever there's a movement on the account, I send a message to the AISP saying something happened on this account, and this is the account from which it came. Now, the question that we want to ask is, who should provide this functionality? And we think there are 2 alternatives here. Either Moduloop could provide it via the PISP interface, or individual DFSPs could provide it individually via their own customer interfaces. Now, as we've seen, there isn't anything in the set of new things which aren't already functionalities that are provided via Moduloop. Actually, the last one probably isn't like that. And no, in fact, it is, because there's nothing to stop a DFSP doing that. So it would be perfectly possible for individual DFSPs to provide each of these services themselves, and for the PISPs, who would not in that case be formal PISPs, they wouldn't be regulated by the Moduloop scheme, just to use the DFSP's interface to make those interactions. So if Moduloop provides it, it reduces the cost for fintechs. They can develop an interface once and use it with any DFSP. It also standardizes the interface, so fintechs can easily understand how to interact with DFSPs. On the other hand, it increases costs for DFSPs. They need to support more functionality on the PISP interface, even if they don't actually provide that service. Even if they don't have customers who want that service. And it also doesn't allow DFSPs to differentiate themselves by providing a better or worse set of functionality and service, which, as we know, is part of the application side of things, which the Level 1 project says should be left up to competition between individual providers. On the other hand, if the DFSPs provide it, then the DFSPs can differentiate themselves by providing a better or worse service and therefore attracting people. And there is a reduced cost for the DFSPs in that they can develop only those services that they see a benefit, and they can offer them to multiple fintechs without additional cost. On the other hand, there are variations in DFSP API structure and coverage, and those will increase the costs for fintechs. It would be nice to think that the open banking APIs for all financial institutions were like each other. Unfortunately, at least in my experience, that's not the case. So fintechs would find themselves having to generate potentially quite a large number of different interfaces to be able to interface with different DFSPs, which might be a significant problem, let's say, for a fintech like the one in the example, which provides payroll services. So for each bank, where an employer had an account, they would have to have potentially a different interface in order to provide their payroll services to that employer. It would also be more difficult for a fintech to move its account to another DFSP. The cost of that might include the need to transfer or rewrite its interfaces for the new DFSP. So in the case of a service provider, which let's say has a single account of the DFSP into which the customers are paying, it might be a problem for them to move their account to another DFSP. Whereas if the services were provided via the Mojaloop PISP interface, then it would be a relatively simple matter for them to move their account to another DFSP, which also supported the PISP interface. So that is a brief sketch, a reasonably brief sketch of the sorts of issues that we want to talk about. And the floor, I think, is yours. We would like to hear what people think.
I'd also like to chime in that we're not saying that each one of the features that Michael highlighted must either be done by the PISP, or sorry, by Mojaloop or by the DFSPs to compete. We can pick and choose and decide maybe there's some that we want to build into Mojaloop and maybe others that we think belong being built into the DFSPs with the variation and competitive nature that comes with it. So it is a bit of a grab bag for certain things. And the three examples we also listed are three that Michael thought of, and I agreed were good ones. I think there's plenty more that could be potentially falling under this third-party umbrella that maybe Michael and I have not thought of. And then there becomes a question for basically all these features. Do we have a blanket policy of it always goes in Mojaloop? Does it always go in the DFSP, or is it a pick and choose we decide depending on the context and nature of the functionality? So there's that aspect as well to consider, because this is a very nuanced space that we want to make sure we do the right thing for some definition of right thing. But I think in our minds, we're looking for a world where when in doubt, we're providing consistency when it makes sense, as long as the burden on the DFSPs is not too exceptional. We don't want a world where DFSPs want to use Mojaloop, like the countries, for example, would really want to deploy Mojaloop, but DFSPs rebel because of all the extra functionality that they have to implement. And they're like, why do I have to support the payroll API? Like, what is this? We want to make sure that we're not getting in the way of adoption by requiring functionality. At the same time, we want to provide as much consistency as possible. So it is, I think, as Michael very clearly pointed out, an important bit of trade-off here, where we're swapping out competitive nature and differentiation versus consistency and additional cost for everyone who wants to integrate. So I just want to make sure that was clear for some of our conversations. And oh, hey, Miller.
Just to add to that, JJ, I mean, there would be nothing to stop a DFSP providing its own version of a service, even if the service could also be provided via the PISP interface.
Absolutely, we could have multiple.
Mm-hmm.
Miller, I see you talking, but we can't hear you.
Vulcan neck pinch required. There we go. I guess I see that the return on investment of implementing features in Mojaloop really depends on it being universally applied to the DFSPs. And early on in the design of Mojaloop, we said that for that to be possible, we had to minimize the requirements for implementation on the DFSPs, or there would be a rejection of this system. And even high modularity, where you could pick and choose between those things that you wanted to offer, it feels awkward because you don't get that kind of market return that you want out of that core infrastructure, the hub-based core infrastructure. So during that time period, we worked with the GSMA, and they developed what they call the Open API, the GSMA's Open API, which is an over-the-top API exposed by the DFSPs for the purposes of merchant acquisition, such as with fintechs. And that is a standardized, semi-standardized API that applies across any DFSP that chooses to implement it. So there you get the optionality. If they are going to acquire merchants and service them, then they have the ability to take that API as is, to extend it with additional features to give them market differentiation. And in no case does it depend on anything more than the common payments transfer functionality already implicit within the hub switch system, in this case, Mojaloop. And so it is a decoupling of those things, and it allows for that market flexibility that is going to be hard to provide. It also means we don't have to do the implementation work for what could become quite a litany of requested functionality that goes beyond payment transfers. I think PISP succeeds because it is such a simple strategy for remote control of transfers between accounts, and it leaves to the wallet provider the ability to put a retail context around that. And that I think maybe is the difference. Whereas we get into account provision, I think there's a lot of study that has to go into that to look at the issues around privacy and disclosures and how you trigger the transactions. The MCOPA case, for example, would be easily handled through the open API, where a MCOPA-like company would take a single DFSP as their merchant provider, get full interoperability across the channels, and the PISP interface could be integrated for the purposes of generating that payment, but the notification and activation of the solar panels would be, through their custom APIs with their merchant provider. So I think there's a way to do these sorts of things now that leaves that more to market choice and maybe less to us making the investment. So I wouldn't foreclose this. I mean, it's something we should study, like what kinds of other functionality that look like PISP should we think about. But I think the bar is pretty high if we are going to get into activating functionality that basically all the DFSPs would have to accept. Over. There must be others on here that want to speak up on this. I looked like I saw Innocent in the chat.
Apparently not.
He doesn't want to come off mute, perhaps.
I just made a comment, Mira. Sorry. Yeah. I'm following and enjoying the conversation and enjoying the scenario of having an MCOPA today in the conversation. Makes it more real. Yeah.
So I suppose part of the thinking behind wanting to include this in the PISP interface is thinking about fintechs as one of the main drivers of uptake for Mojaloop systems. And it certainly seems to be the case, as far as I can see, that there is a great deal more interest in Mojaloop among third-party providers, potential third-party providers, than there is among financial institutions. Perhaps I've got this wrong, but that's my impression. And therefore, it seemed to us, at least as a possibility, that it was something where we should be I won't say G'ing them up to make demands of the financial institutions, but that sort of thing, effectively to say, here are things that will make it easier for you to transform your great business ideas into things that actually make and receive payments. All you need to do is get the DFSPs to join in.
I see a couple comments in the chat. Matt making the point that the GSMA API is fairly mature at this point. And as Paul's saying, that many of the merchants, the fintech merchants, will select a partner and integrate with them. As it is today, they have to integrate with all of them, which is what Mojaloop solves for. So it is essentially already assisting with that, making it more valuable. I do think that there's a PISP strategy for some of these kinds of merchants, but honestly, it feels a little bit of a competition between merchant request to pay through the standard over-the-top interfaces and a wallet-based interaction, which is the third-party wallet strategy that PISP implements. That might be worth structuring that a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the I don't know, Matt, maybe you could chime in, but in the hackathon environments, are the fintechs utilizing the open API? Is it being exposed to their use in a way that we could sort of test the theory of how complete that is for that use?
Certainly, it's available for such use. It's open and free to use, and the lab has sort of validation services to help folks make sure they've implemented it the proper way. I believe it has been used in a couple of hackathons, but let me double check on that. But if anyone has questions or wants connection to it, more than happy to share out both contact info and links to the resources.
And there's a problem. Sorry, carry on.
No, that's all right. Go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say, there is a problem with some of the GSMI interface at the moment, isn't there, in that it doesn't provide a bulk quotation endpoint at the moment. They've added one for individual transfers, but not for bulk. So it's not currently possible, if I've understood it correctly, for a third payroll bureau, for instance, to use the GSMA interface to run a payability test.
That's where I was going as well, is to say the completeness of the over-the-top API is an important aspect, but we shouldn't dodge its lack of completeness by re-implementing that functionality on top of PISP, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think there's enough similarity between what a wallet provider wants, and we've provided in PISP, and what a merchant or a fintech wants in a merchant request to pay scenario, that it's easy to confuse those two interfaces. I think, though, that we should study carefully the original design and say that merchants are handled through a request to pay scenario. That's the way we connect the business logic to the transfer. And that PISP is really intended for an entirely different purpose, which is this sort of third-party control of the payment transfer process, with potential to connect business logic behind that wallet experience. But it's not quite the same thing. In the case where PISP, the wallet provider has a relationship with the end customer who's doing the pay, and you shouldn't need that when you do a merchant request to pay in quite that same way. It can be implemented in a more straightforward merchant/consumer interaction. I think it's probably worth studying a bit, but
yeah. And I just want to pick up Steve's point, thinking that PISP would be more useful to banks than wallets. I think I'm right in thinking, but perhaps I'm not, that the GSMA interface has not been taken up by non-mobile companies. Is that correct? And certainly, I think some of these. Sorry, carry on, Matt.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't say that across the board, but that is a generally true statement. And
some of these, I think, like the bulk initiation for payroll providers and things like that, as Steve says, as Paul and Steve say, it's more likely that though people who have large payments to make, which might also include government institutions, of course, will be banking with banks. Will want to transfer out of banks. And therefore the ability to do bulk request to pay via the PISP interface might be a useful one.
I mean, Paul's really put the point on it, which is that the reason we want this is because you don't want to wait for a bank to come up with something that competes with Google Wallet, as an example. We waited a long time. And, it's all about providing a custom experience that sits on top of that while allowing the authentication and authorizations to reside with the licensed institution. I think that's a good separation, but that was a very purpose-designed sort of view of how those things work. And then to extend that into a merchant relationship, I think is not correct. We'd have to look, I think, at that quite differently. If MRTP is not meeting the requirements, why would be the question. We would really want to study that first before we simply hop on the other. I will say that Open API from GSMA, I think, is attempting to provide much of the same functionality that Open Banking provides for banks. And so though there's a definite gap in both in concept and function, and Open Banking is a pretty thick interface, and it's not widely implemented. It's outside of Europe, I guess. But that as we see that kind of approach taken up by banks, it closes the gap on their side. They can then chase these kinds of over-the-top fintechs and others that want to interact with their account holders. And Open GSMA API allows for that market to develop its response to the need for innovation. Again, I don't see the PISP necessarily extending into that space quite so quickly because it's hosted by the hub and the interactions are hosted through the hub. That's really all we're relying on, right, is the communication pathways, and a standardization of the requirements on the DFSPs to support certain interactions. I'm not sure.
I mean, that's, I think, the problem with bank APIs, bank open APIs. I was sort of vaguely involved in some of this in Kenya a while ago, and they are different from each other. I mean, each bank undertakes its own implementation of open banking according to what are quite generally articulated principles. And of course, as is the way of these things, they all wind up looking like how that bank works internally. And therefore, it's not at all easy to generalize such that you can move an interface from one bank to another. From that perspective, I think the open banking promise has been slow to materialize. Sorry, Mabel.
No, but that's the point, is that it's really about portability of an account. And that's a merchant requirement, perhaps, but it may not be. You pick the relationship you want and you move in infrequently. Of course, lock-ins are a tool used by commerce service providers to lock you in, but it doesn't stop, for example, Visa and MasterCard from both competing in the same market with wildly different messaging interfaces on their systems, despite the fact there's a lot of standardization. Trying to implement a wallet that does both Visa Direct and MasterPass, for instance. First, they probably wouldn't allow it, but if you did, you would be implementing two completely different APIs and idiomatic strategies for message passing and so forth. So I think if we really reduce this down to who are we serving, we get down to an underexpressed MRTP that we really need to focus more attention on, make that right so that the standard merchants have a way to connect into the system and solve for the lack of pull, since we don't support pull payments. And then having done that, independently, the wallet interface allows for the surfacing of these core use cases through wallets rather than through the DFSPs themselves, which I think solves for the two cases. You either have an interface to a fintech for in-purpose payments that's over the top, or you have the need to put a better user interface on the payment system rather than waiting for banks and mobile operators to provide it for you. And it minimizes the implementation surface area that a DFSP has to implement. Because if they're not uniformly implemented, I don't think it works, right? I think that's the challenge. If you had three of them implementing it, but you have 35 providers in the market, I don't think it works quite so well. That's what UPI did. They basically said, you all have to implement it. If we send you a PIN request, you have to answer it. And you have to use our code so we can be sure it's secure. This is super good, though. I'm really glad you guys brought this up because it's something we should debate. And maybe there's something we could put on the agenda in Zanzibar as well to maybe get a little closer to it, especially around MRTP.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome.
So we will continue the discussion. For those who are interested, there is it's an issue on the CCB GitHub page, and we would be very interested to receive comments from anyone on that. So I will actually, that's what I will do, is I will stick that in the chat at some point.
That would be useful. Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm going to bring this to a close. We're about 5 minutes over. So thank you so much to JJ, Michael, Sam, and all the others.